Welcome to the Insomnia Coach podcast. My name is Martin Reed. I believe that nobody needs to live with chronic insomnia and that cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia, CBT-I techniques, can help you enjoy better sleep for the rest of your life. Jeff is 46 years old and married with 2 children. His daughter is 5 years old and his son is 2. He works remotely for a real estate investment company, and in his spare time he enjoys trail running, exercising, golf, and socializing with friends. Jeff often found it hard to fall asleep, especially when he was under a lot of stress. When he gained additional job responsibilities and became a parent, those difficult nights became more common, and this led to a lot of sleep-related fear, worry, and anxiety. After trying to implement cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia, CBT-I techniques, with the help of a book, Jeff continued to struggle until he started implementing CBT-I techniques with the ongoing support and guidance of a sleep coach, me. Within 8 weeks of implementing CBT-I techniques, Jeff went from taking a sleeping pill every 3 to 5 days and managing to get around 5.5 hours of sleep to averaging 6.5 hours of sleep each night without any sleeping pills. 10 months after we stopped working together, Jeff is still sleeping well and feels far more confident about his ability to sleep. Furthermore, he now has all the skills he needs to get his sleep back on track should he ever struggle with sleep again in the future. In this episode, Jeff shares the specific CBT-I techniques he found most helpful and why working with a coach proved to be the most effective way to recover sleep confidence, get rid of sleep-related worry and anxiety, and enjoy better sleep. A full transcript of this podcast and an accompanying video can be found at insomniacoach.com/podcast. Okay, so thank you so much for being with us today, Jeff.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
So can we get started by going back to the beginning? When did your sleep problems begin? And can you remember what the initial trigger was to your sleep disruption?
You know, I was thinking about this question, and it's hard to pinpoint exactly when my sleep trouble started, but I feel like for most of my life, I've really had some struggles falling asleep. And, sometimes that means, it can take an hour to 45 minutes. I think when things were sort of normal for me. But that got a lot worse when I was under stress. And, that feels like it was with me ever since I was probably in my 20s or teens up until now. I'm 46. And I was thinking back to, one of the first triggers that caught my attention, which was I had started working in a job that I really enjoyed, and I was getting a little bit more responsibility in it. And I just was putting a lot of pressure on myself. And I remember, working toward one particular deadline and just being so anxious that I had to get this thing done. And I had one of those literal sleepless nights where I got no sleep. And that had never happened. I mean, I had nights when, I had gotten 3 or 4 hours of sleep, but this was a night where my anxiety just built and built and built every hour, and I was watching the clock and getting more anxious, the story with all this. Mm-hmm. And, I think about 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning, I just decided, well, I'm up for the day. So I'm just going to go into work. And I went into work and, just started working about 6 in the morning. And, my boss was real nice about it. I told him what had happened. And he told me to leave, about 12 o'clock or 1 o'clock later that day. He was real sympathetic. But, I was really hard on myself. And I said, what's going on here that this has happened? This feels like a problem. And then fast forward, years later, I hadn't had a night like that for a long time. And I've probably had 6 of those sleepless nights when I literally have had, no minutes of sleep, no hours. You'll hear people say, I had sleepless nights, but it was literally those, half a dozen sleepless nights that began to get my attention.
Mm-hmm.
And, I think later, my son, I have 2 kids, my daughter's 5 and my son is 2 now. And I think when my son was born, there were some new insomnia things that popped up for me. I started to get less and less sleep, partly because of him, but also there's more pressure and responsibility of being, a parent of 2 kids, and my job responsibilities got heavier. So I think it was just more stress and anxiety I was putting on myself that really kind of triggered this latest phase when I finally kind of found your course.
Mm-hmm. So, I think a lot of people will really identify with your description there. I just finished recording another podcast episode with someone that their story is so similar to yours in that they recognized that they often had these nights where they struggled, but that almost just became part of their life. They didn't actually worry about that too much. They just recognized that they were someone that every now and then they would struggle with sleep. But then they had this one night where they got no sleep. And that kind of raised the arousal levels, that led to this more worry, like, oh, has everything been building up to this now? Have I somehow maybe lost the ability to sleep or something like this? And It was just the way it transitioned from just these occasional struggles, maybe just accepting that, to this night of no sleep. And that's what kind of set everything into motion and just really perpetuated the problem.
Right. Yeah, there's a lot of fear. I can relate to the fear of, something's broken, something's not right. And, the fear of, can I get this back? Do I have the ability to sleep normally again? And kids certainly break that a little bit to some degree, but, joking aside, you can get that back as I've learned.
So did you find that whatever it was, whatever the stress that was in your life or the worry that was in your life that was kind of triggering these occasional sleep issues and that night of no sleep, did that kind of then transition into you were finding that pretty much all of your worry and anxiety was related to sleep, or do you think it was still related to whatever these external stressors were?
I think the worries about sleep came around as bedtime got closer. It's that sleep anxiety as it got to be bedtime, and that continued to build and get stronger as I struggled more with sleep. And as my son was a pretty good sleeper. My wife and I had more struggles with my first child, my daughter, because partly we didn't know what we were doing. But with my son, we handled that a little better. But still, after we got through the infant phase and he started teething, and that phase was kind of unpredictable. So there was a little bit of uncertainty thrown in. Even if I felt like I could fall asleep, there was this worry that he was going to wake up, and whether it was my night or my wife's night to go and soothe him added some uncertainty to that anxiety. But it was really just learning how to deal with my anxiety and stress in life with, a buffer period before bedtime. And that was one of the big things that was very helpful about your course, is sort of learning how to cope with that at bedtime and taking, an hour before I went to bed to wind down, because I never did that before. And that was a big difference.
Yeah, on that note, isn't it really interesting that especially as parents, we recognize that we can't put our kids to bed when they're in hyper mode, right? If they're running around the house, we recognize as parents that there's no point trying to put our kids to bed right now. They need to relax, maybe read some books. But yet we never kind of transfer that recognition onto ourselves, right? We're quite happy to go to bed and try to sleep when we're still feeling really wound up by the day. We just don't take our own advice.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, it's the kids get treated with, the utmost care, and we tend to neglect that part of ourselves, especially as parents.
Yeah.
And,
Awesome.
just not having the tools or knowledge of how to take care of myself around sleep. I don't, that was part of it too, is this education around how do I help myself get to sleep, and that was huge in taking your course and learning those tools to teach myself how to do that. That was a
Yeah.
big deal.
So would you say that when you were going through like the height of your struggles with sleep, was your main issue just trying to fall asleep at the start of the night, or was it more to do with you'd wake during the night and then find it hard to fall asleep, or maybe both?
Definitely falling asleep for me. I almost never had trouble falling back to sleep. Occasionally a few times when my kids were waking up in the middle of the night and I'd go in and soothe them and put them back to sleep. But almost always for me, it was falling asleep. Once I could get to sleep, I was in good shape.
Yeah.
But that initial anxiety of just getting to sleep was always my issue.
Mhm. So before you found my online course, before you found out about cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia techniques, what kind of things had you done, if anything, to try and get your sleep back on track?
That's a good question. Well, eventually I I did talk to my doctor about it, my general practitioner, primary care doctor, and I think I'm trying to remember. Temazepam was the last medication that he prescribed to me that is a benzo. But you know, I I don't like to take medication when I don't, you know, I do anything I can, especially around sleep, to not take any medication. And over the years, I think I had taken some over-the-counter medication, those things you can get at any drugstore, and those were very limited, and I always
Hmm.
felt, lousy the next day after taking those. But there was one anti-anxiety medication that I also took before temazepam, and I forget the name of it. You may know it, but it was never really good for sleep. It was more about treating anxiety, but I just never felt good the next day. I had cotton mouth and felt like I was hungover for most of the day. But the temazepam, I started using it sporadically, and eventually I got up to where I was using it, 2 to 3 times a week. And that's when I really started to worry that I knew that it was going to wear off and that I wasn't going to be as effective. I was going to have to take more of it. And I didn't want to go down that path. So I was looking for anything to get me off of that and just to learn more natural techniques to put myself to sleep.
Yeah, a lot of people say this to me. A lot of people start working with me, and they're actually already taking medication, maybe even been taking it for years. And it's interesting because some people vary in their response. So some people these sleeping medications, they're just not working anymore, and other people are like, I take these sleeping medications, so when you look at my sleep logs, my sleep journal, it will say that I'm getting sleep, but it's medicated sleep, so it's not the same. But the commonality here is that I think everyone kind of just doesn't want to, they recognize that it's not helpful to be relying on this medication.
Right.
They kind of just want to get off it, which I think it's almost like when you read in the media, people are just like, well, people can just take a tablet, then they'll sleep, then they'll be fine. What's the big deal? But in
Yeah.
reality, when that's you don't feel comfortable relying on something or believing that you can't sleep unless you take, whether it's a pill or a supplement or any other kind of like sleep crutch. You just want to get to that stage, like you were before you had any problem with sleep, where you just don't really think about sleep, don't worry about sleeping. You just have confidence in your own ability to sleep.
Yeah, it's full. Medication is just fool's gold around sleep because it's never going to be a good long-term solution, even if it gets you to sleep,
Yeah.
for 6 months. Or I think I had been taking my temazepam maybe for 4 to 5 months or so,
Hmm.
and I just knew I just needed to find a way to get off of that. So I was, looking for different alternatives.
Mhm.
And I can talk more about some of that, when we get into this more.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let's move on to that then. So, I mean, you found out about cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia. I'll just refer to it as CBT-I from this point on. But I believe that you didn't find out about CBT-I from me originally. You found out about it from another source.
That's right. I had a it was, I can remember it vividly. I was going to a therapist to try and get some support around this insomnia and some other anxiety issues. And she recommended Dr. Greg Jacobs' book, which I know you know about,
Mhm.
the Say Goodnight to Insomnia. And I got it. I read it. I was very excited about it because the concepts in there made so much sense, and
Right.
they're somewhat similar to your course, a lot of the techniques. And I started to read it and to work the course, and I got stuck. And he actually has, Dr. Jacobs has a method where you can sign up for emails with him, but it sounds like a joke, but they're limited to like 2 sentences. You could send them like one email per week, and it was limited to 2 sentences. And it just didn't work for me. It was very frustrating because I had so many questions about different ways to approach the techniques.
Mhm.
And I just felt like I was on an island, that I didn't have the support I needed because, you know, and I had this experience in your course, but you were quick to explain that this was just part of the process. I'd have some good nights, like 2 or 3 good nights, and then I would have a really bad night or two in a
Mhm.
row. And it would throw me off track. I would get really discouraged and say, this isn't working. And, looking back on it, it was working, but I just didn't have that long view on it because I was right in it.
Mhm.
But I had a night when I got no sleep. I got, again, no hours of sleep in this book course that I was doing. And may have been in the second week or the third week. And I just didn't know if I was doing it right. And I was so frustrated. I felt like that was my rock bottom that led me to your course. So it was about 4 a.m, and I knew, my night's sleep was shot. So I just got on the computer and started looking. What I was looking for was some kind of support group, a chat room or something online, some kind of forum
Mhm.
where people could kind of commiserate and share experiences. And I found your website, and I looked at the forum briefly, but I more looked at the coaching piece, and I thought, wow, that's quite a concept. I just hadn't seen that before. And I was just like, this is it. This is what I need. I need this personal piece to the course and the process to help me along, because I couldn't do it by myself. So that's what led to me signing up.
Yeah, I think that you made a really important point there, in that a lot of it is this, just having that person or having access to someone just to give you that support, the reassurance, just to know that you're implementing the techniques correctly and appropriately, and just to keep you motivated and to go through it, because the
Right.
techniques themselves are relatively straightforward, and you can learn all the CBTI techniques in any number of books. There's plenty of books out there, and Jacob's book is definitely one of the better ones. But because when you're implementing these techniques, they at first can also seem counterintuitive, right? How does the idea of getting out of bed, how's that going to help me
Exactly.
get more sleep, for
That was the
example?
killer.
Yeah, exactly. Like things like that. Yeah, I think you've got to be so self-disciplined and really self-motivated, and really just have a lot of confidence in what you're doing to just do it alone, because it can be so challenging. And I think that it really does make a difference just when you've got access to someone to help address any questions or concerns you've got, keep you motivated. And also, a lot of clients tell me just to give me that accountability, because I know that at the end of the week or at the end of every 2 weeks, I'm going to have someone looking at my sleep diary and making sure that I'm following this sleep window, that I'm implementing the techniques I'm learning. And I think it can make a really big difference.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, there's so many points in the course where there's just a lot of nuance and needed clarification on, well, and I'm a detail oriented person, so I appreciate the attention to detail around certain things. And that, the getting out of bed every 30-minute rule was so tough mentally, just because you knew you weren't going to get, if you get out of bed that you're probably out at least 45 minutes of sleep, because you're up for 30 minutes and then getting back in bed and taking at least 15 minutes to fall back asleep. But just what you brought, the coaching piece, was that, hey, this is not supposed to help your sleep tonight. It's about the long term and going to help you, long term. This is about building those associations. And that was key, just to get that personal feedback on that.
Yeah, that's really important to bear in mind. So this technique is known as stimulus control, and we're basically just trying to get you to relearn to see the bed as a place for sleep, and relaxation, just like it was in the past before you had any sleep issues. And the way we do that is by making sure that the only thing we do in bed is sleep. So anytime that we're in bed and we're really struggling, normally it's a better idea to just get out of bed until you feel relaxed and calm again, and then return to bed. And just through repeatedly doing that, your brain kind of slowly learns that, oh, I can't just be alert and anxious and frustrated because he'll just get out of bed, So over time, you learn to just reassociate the bed with sleep, because in the short term, yeah, it can definitely lead to a little bit less sleep. But you also can bear in mind that if you get a little bit less sleep that night, your sleep drive is still building, so the urge to sleep gets stronger and stronger. So as long as you're still observing an appropriate sleep window, you're not going to bed earlier in the day to make up for this additional sleepiness or staying in bed later, the urge to sleep is just going to get so strong that you will end up sleeping in your own bed, and the need to keep getting out of bed during the night will become less frequent. You'll need to do it less often. But over the short term, it can definitely be difficult. And I think it is really important to emphasize that to people, that getting out of bed is not intended to help you sleep that very night. It really is just this long-term strategy to go back to where you were in the past, where the bed is effectively a strong trigger for sleep rather than worry, wakefulness, and anxiety.
Right. Absolutely. Right.
Yeah. So you mentioned that was one of the techniques that you initially struggled with. Were there any other CBT-I techniques that you found difficult, at least in the short term?
I think in the short term, adjusting my sleep window to such a small period of sleep, like 5.5 hours, I think, the getting up at the same time every morning was not a big deal, because I had gotten that down pretty much with my kids. I had gotten up at like 5:30 or 6 every morning anyway with them, to get in my exercise and just start my day. But if I was getting up at 5:30, going to bed like initially, like having that more narrow sleep window, that was harder for me, more mentally, just the idea that, okay, because I still had that hang up about, I've got to get, at least 7.5, 8 hours of sleep. I still had that myth in my head that that's what I needed. And that was a really key piece of information to understand, because I've found out that I don't need that at all. 7 hours, 6.5 is good for me. And I never knew that, But initially, going to bed at like midnight or 11:30, knowing that the maximum sleep I could get was 5.5 or 6 hours, that was just tough mentally, because I still had those old hang-ups about how much sleep I thought I needed. And, struggling with that a little bit in the short term, I think was probably the second toughest thing, in addition to getting out of bed, every 30 minutes, and having those nights when you'd have to get up and out of bed, a few times or 3 or 4 times, and just had a tough night of sleep. And just trying to keep the long view about that early on was, I think, the hardest part.
Yeah, so I think you just this second touched upon this, but what if someone's listening to this and they're trying these, or they've tried in the past these techniques, and they really identify with this idea that, the thought of only allotting 5.5 or 6 hours for sleep, the thought of getting out of bed during the night when I'm struggling with sleep, that in itself is making me feel worried. Like, so how would you address that if someone was with those concerns, because you've been through that yourself? How did you get through it? How did you overcome those fears and those worries and actually implement the techniques?
Well, I think, and you explain it well, in that eventually you move that sleep window back to what becomes, the more appropriate window for yourself. And I think just really kind of getting that concept in your bones, which is, it's hard, it's easy to understand intellectually at first, but just understanding that at a gut level, like, okay, I'm going to do this. I'm going to be tired for a little bit, but I'm going to start sleeping better. It's going to take me less time to fall asleep. And that happened. I feel like that it didn't take that long for it to happen. Maybe, 3 or 4 days or a week of
Mm-hmm.
it's, I got to be so tired that I would fall asleep within sometimes 10 minutes, sometimes 15 minutes, in that range.
Mm-hmm.
And, that was proving to me, once I started to do that, that was proving that this was working. And it was kind of a simultaneous understanding too, that I didn't need, those 8 hours of sleep to function. Because I like to exercise in the morning. I exercise about 6 days a week, and I always had the thought fixed in my head that I must get a good night of sleep to be able to exercise. It's just not true. I mean, until I kind of went through it and found that I was able to exercise actually just fine on a lousy night of sleep. Even if I got 2 or 3 hours of sleep, I still could pretty much do all of the workouts that I had done before. I might be a little bit more tired. If I got 2 or 3 nights of tough sleep is when I usually felt it more, but kind of going through those experiences and learning that I was able to function much better without sleep than I had thought. And so much of that had to do with attitude. And I can talk more about that, because that was a really key mental hurdle to kind of just change my attitude around losing sleep.
Yeah, that's really common among people with insomnia, is there's a lot of fear and worry over how they're going to get through the next day. So when you're struggling with sleep during the night, you kind of perpetuate the problem by worrying about how you're ever going to get through the day, or I've got
Right.
all these deadlines coming up at work. I need to be on my A game, or I have a really important job, like people are depending on me. I've got to be at my best. But upon reflection, I think almost everyone with insomnia can recognize a number of times where they have got through the day after a really bad night of sleep. I like to say that people with insomnia are experts at getting through the day after little to no sleep. They're the best people in the world at doing it, but yet they're the people that are most worried about how they're going to get through the day when they're struggling with sleep.
Yes, so true, so true. And you know, I had, when you keep that sleep diary and go through all those nights and you're so focused on how much sleep you get, I got so dialed in on knowing how I would feel based on 2 hours of sleep or 4 hours of sleep or 6 hours or 5 hours. I mean, I could really tell, kind of a difference between the different amounts of sleep I would get. And, I noticed for myself, if I could get even 4 hours of sleep, that I could do just fine. Even on 3 and 2, I could be okay. I knew I could get through the day without too much. The tiredness would not affect me so much that I couldn't do my job and couldn't do the other things.
Mm-hmm.
But just getting like 4 hours of sleep sounds like, to a lot of people I talk to, they say, "Oh, that's terrible. That's no sleep at all." And I'm just like, it's actually not that bad.
Yeah.
I've had a lot worse after going through those nights of no sleep or 2 hours or 3 hours or whatever it would be. You kind of learn with those experiences, how to thrive and just to operate on that sleep. I think just going through those experiences is part of everybody's process.
Yeah, and I think another reason why that can be so helpful, just recognizing your ability to get through the day, is it's so easy and so tempting to modify our days or modify our entire lives around sleep.
Right.
So we might cancel plans with friends, call in sick to work, and kind of take away all these things that we enjoy in life in response to the insomnia. So, in effect, we're actually guaranteeing that our insomnia is going to have a negative impact on our quality of life. Not to downplay it, because on long-term insomnia does definitely affect your quality of life, but we actually on an individual level have so much influence over those outcomes if we can just kind of push through the day as much as possible as though the insomnia doesn't exist. This can
Right.
actually help us recognize that the quality of our day isn't as connected to the quality of our sleep as we often think. And if nothing else, it gives us the opportunity to still enjoy our days or just have a few enjoyable moments during the day, which
Right.
can just be such a boost to your overall quality of life.
And that's so true. And I used to be guilty of that, like not doing certain things, whether it was socializing or just doing things a little bit differently to avoid talking to people, or um, just uh, almost like trying to conserve my energy because I
Mm,
thought, well, I haven't got enough sleep, so I need to conserve my energy. But the concept that was so helpful was that I'm building sleep pressure, the idea of building sleep pressure. And instead of conserving energy, saying, I'm just going to live my day to the fullest here because I'm building my sleep pressure, I'm one day closer to having a good night's sleep,
mhm.
which was always true. And it was very rare for me to have more than 2 nights of poor sleep. Occasionally I had 3 in a row, maybe a few times, but I almost always would sleep well after a poor night of sleep, one night or 2 nights. It was never more than that.
Mhm.
And that was kind of buoyed my confidence a little bit to know that no matter what, I'm going to be getting some sleep this night or the next night.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. Just going back to what you said earlier was, when I asked you how you managed to get through that short-term pain when you were implementing the techniques, the difficulty, the challenges associated with allotting less time for sleep and getting out of bed when you can't sleep, because that's a big concern, quite rightly, for people with insomnia. But what I like to say to them is, yeah, that's definitely going to be unpleasant in the short term. The idea of spending less time in bed, getting out of bed when you're struggling. But how is your life right now with insomnia? Probably not
Right.
pleasant, but yet right now there's no real end in sight because you're probably not implementing these evidence-based CBT-I techniques that are so effective for people. So how about you just transfer your current situation, which is kind of unpleasant right now, but with no real end in sight, to an equally perhaps unpleasant situation, but the difference is there is that end in sight because you're working towards this long-term goal of just better sleep and more sleep confidence.
So true. And I'm the type of person that I love to have a plan for
Mm,
for anything, and just having a strategy or a plan for anything, especially a problem, that I've identified. Having some kind of plan in place is so reassuring for me. And I feel like I can go through any short-term pain if I have some kind of plan that, I have some confidence in, even if I'm not fully confident that it's going to turn out, you know, the way I hope it does in the end. If I have some confidence in it, which I did in this course, it's so helpful because it's just like, I can get through this. This is only eight
mm,
weeks. I mean, that's nothing. I mean, I can, and having kids, you can probably relate to this. Having kids helps that because you're like, man, I got through that first year of my first child, which was not easy from a sleep standpoint. It was the shock and awe campaign. And
mhm.
if I can get through that, I can get through anything. So just having some of that experience.
Yeah, I think the plan, like having that plan in place, can definitely be really helpful. Like I like to refer to it as kind of this roadmap. So because I just feel that when you've got insomnia, when it's the middle of the night, you're kind of by yourself, you're feeling quite isolated, so your mind's just going a mile a minute. You have all these mental gymnastics. What can I do to help myself fall asleep? What should I be doing now? What should I do if this happens again tomorrow? When you're implementing these CBT-I techniques, especially if you're working with a coach or a therapist or another kind of someone else trained in insomnia, they can work with you and give you this roadmap. So it kind of just removes all that mental rumination. So you have a plan in place. You know exactly what to do. You know when the best time is to go to bed. You know if you're struggling, you know what to do. You know when to get out of bed. You just have that plan in place. You can kind of switch off all of that mental rumination. Kind of just engage this robot mind. It's almost like computer programming language. There's no room for doubt anymore. You have a question or a concern or a doubt, and there's an answer for it, like what you should be doing in response.
Right. Yeah, it's a well-established process that's in place, and I just need to follow it to the best of my abilities, and I'm going to get some results. Even, and when the struggles or doubts pop up, I think that's where having the access to you as a coach to email and get feedback that's specific is so helpful to just clarify those things. And that sort of, is like stepping on the fire of doubt when those fires start and you're like, oh, I'm going to put that doubt out, it just eliminates all the doubts going forward as you go through it.
Yeah, absolutely. So you mentioned that, the sleep window and stimulus control, the idea of getting out of bed, doing nothing in bed apart from sleep, were quite challenging, but it sounds like you definitely found them helpful. Would you say that they were the two techniques that you found most helpful, or were there any other techniques as you went through the course that you also found really helpful that maybe were a little bit less challenging in the short term?
I think the getting out of bed is a technique that I still use. That's a big one that's so helpful to get me to go back to sleep. That's a big takeaway from the program. The relaxation techniques, I think, were helpful also to get me to pause my day, to take 15 minutes out of the day to do a meditation and do some relaxation. Those were very helpful. Trying to think of some other.
You mentioned earlier about the buffer zone. Was that something that you found helpful?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I'd put that up there. That that and getting out of bed, the 30-minute rule, I think, are probably the two most important things. And I even to this day, if I don't take that buffer zone time for myself, whether it's 30 minutes or an hour or whatever it is, some nights it doesn't have to be as long as others, but if I don't do that, I do find that I have trouble falling asleep still. But if I just go back to that process for myself, it's so helpful, and it really helps me to wind down and helps me to go to sleep. And there'll be nights where there's something unusual going on that kind of creeps into my usual buffer time. But I think the idea of like, I've got, I used to have such a fixated idea on I've got to get to bed by, X by 10 o'clock if I'm going to get my 8 hours of sleep. And just like, it was just racing to get to bed. And that anxiety was just so useless because, then I'd be in bed for an hour and a half. And it's like, why not take 30 minutes to read, wind down, and then get into bed 30 minutes later? And that concept was so helpful too. So taking that buffer time, even if I'm getting to bed later than I had wanted to, and not being anxious about it is so key. Because knowing that, hey, if I'm going to get 6 hours maybe tonight versus 7, but I know that that's okay, and I can function absolutely perfectly on 6 hours of sleep, no problem. Especially if I've had, a week or 3 or 4 nights of good sleep before that, it's not even detectable for me.
Yeah, I really like the buffer zone. It's just for those listening that don't know what we're talking about, it's basically just this period before you're planning to go to bed, maybe half an hour or an hour, where it's just you time. You can do whatever you want as long as you just find it relaxing and enjoyable. And the it's pretty straightforward. The idea behind it is it's just that time for you to just unwind and relax. And it can also be really helpful because not only does it help you unwind and relax, but it helps you recognize cues for sleepiness. So, you
Right.
can, let's say the activity you choose to do is reading. As soon as you start to get those heavy eyes, you're reading the same line over and over again, you can recognize those cues for sleepiness. And it just helps increase the likelihood that you're going to be going to bed when you're ready for sleep, not when you're tired, but when you're actually sleepy.
Right, right. Yeah, and that the reading was and still is my go-to on in the buffer time. I've got some short kind of daily meditative readings, and then I have a book of some sort that is always interesting to me, but not, doesn't get me too excited.
Mm-hmm.
And I like to read a lot of history, and some of that I find fascinating, but also not, it's kind of perfect bedtime reading because it's not so exciting and thrilling like, watching something on TV for me that I get those heavy eyes and I'm on the same page for the last minute, and that's when I know it's time. It's time to start heading to bed.
Yeah, and I think it was interesting what you mentioned, that you emphasized that what's relaxing for one person isn't going to be relaxing for another, so you like to read a type of book, or there's certain TV you might not find helpful, or certain types of programming you might not find helpful, but other people might like to watch an episode of The Simpsons or watch a documentary, and that's perfectly fine. It really is just whatever you personally find relaxing and enjoyable, because we're not trying to generate sleep, we're just trying to help you unwind and just maybe recognize those cues for sleepiness. That's all it's about. We're not kind of looking for something that's generating sleep here. So it really is whatever just works for you on an individual level.
Yeah, and I had a trial and error period for myself. Just I did some music, listened to some soft music, or I drink some tea or something to help me. And it always kind of came back to reading. So I had to really kind of figure out what was my best tool and technique for that time. But I
Mm-hmm.
feel comfortable now, a year later, kind of knowing what that is.
Yeah. So we worked together for 8 weeks in total. Um, was there a certain point as we were working together when you kind of things started to make sense, like the dots started to connect, and you started to recognize that, hey, these techniques, some of them are difficult, but I can recognize that they're starting to work now?
Yeah, I think in keeping the sleep diaries, I started to track and notice I'd get 3 or 4 nights of sleep that were really good, 6.5 to 7 hours of sleep. Some weeks it would be 5 or 6 nights when I would be at least 6.5 hours of sleep. Just seeing that was a confidence builder. And the time it took me to fall asleep on some of those, sometimes it was even 5 minutes, which I know is unusual.
Mm.
But it was usually in that 10 to 15 minute range. And you helped me to understand that, falling asleep within 30 minutes, up to 30 minutes was pretty average for people. And that was helpful because I always felt like, because my dad had the ability to fall asleep like immediately when his head hit the pillow. And I never could understand it. I think he was probably exhausted most of the time, and that was the reason. But I found out, that's actually not very normal. God bless people that can do it, but 30 minutes was more average.
Yeah, and that is a common misconception that people with insomnia have. They really believe, many of us believe, that we should be falling asleep, within 5 or 10 minutes of getting into bed. But in the field of sleep, if you're falling asleep regularly within 10 minutes, we would consider that excessive sleepiness.
Yeah.
And that's not normally something we'd associate with insomnia, because the symptoms of insomnia are typically more related to fatigue, this feeling of being worn out, rather than actually struggling to stay awake. So if someone is regularly falling asleep within 10 minutes of getting into bed, that could be a symptom of some other issue that's going on.
Right.
Typically we find that people fall asleep within around like 10 minutes to half an hour is the average kind of range. So if I'm looking at someone's sleep diary and they're falling asleep within about half an hour, that really is nothing to be concerned about, because that's quite normal. And I think that's important to emphasize to people.
I think too, going back to your original question about when did the light bulb go on a little bit for me, when I look at my diary and see, oh, I averaged, 6.5 hours of sleep, or six and three quarters hours. That was big. And also identifying that 1 or 2 nights of poor sleep, whether it was a 5-hour night or a 4-hour night, out of 7 nights was still pretty good compared to where I was coming from. And, I tend to get, focused on the negative, and would focus on those 2 nights and say, why isn't this perfect yet? But focusing on the good days and the good nights of sleep was really key for me to just understand and just take in the progress that I was making. That was important for my mindset.
Yeah, it really is so important to make yourself put emphasis on all the good nights, because it is so easy. If we don't consciously make the effort, our brain just naturally wants to focus on the problematic nights. I think it's like this survival mechanism. The brain sees that as a problem that it has to solve. So it spends all this time dwelling on those 1 or 2 nights where there's been that struggle, and completely disregards the 5 days where you've got really good sleep. So I think it is important to take that step back and recognize and draw attention, force yourself to focus on all the good nights rather than the bad. I think that is key. On the note of the sleep diary, when you learned that you'd be keeping a sleep diary, did that lead to any like worry or anxieties? For some people, they fear that actively keeping a log of their sleep is going to draw more attention and more focus on sleep, and it's going to lead to more difficulty sleeping as a result. Do you identify with that, or did you have any of those kind of feelings?
I definitely identify with that. I'm, a recovering perfectionist, and still have a lot of perfectionistic tendencies that I like keeping records and logs like that, because I like to track my progress. I think the key for that was just to focus on the good nights, and to say, and I would do averages for myself. Like every week I would do an average and see, I averaged, because the averaging for me helped eliminate some of the negative thinking around the bad night. Especially the concept that you had discussed in your course about, 5.5 hours of sleep being core sleep. That was also a really key piece of information for me to learn, knowing that if I can get 5.5 hours of sleep, that's great. A lot of people do it kind of long term on that, and that kind of understanding just helped eliminate any anxiety around having 1 or 2 nights of bad sleep. So keeping the log, and even if I had, some bad nights, doing some of that averaging kind of helped lose the stigma around the bad nights.
Yeah, and I also think that sleep diaries can be helpful just as a measure of progress.
Yeah.
It can definitely be difficult when you're filling out the sleep diary for the first couple of weeks and maybe your sleep is just looking atrocious. Maybe that's leading to more worry. But typically people with insomnia already recognize their sleep as being pretty poor. So I find that the sleep diary doesn't really exacerbate that. But what it does is it draws your attention to any progress that you're making, improvements that you're making that maybe you'd otherwise have missed, and I think you drew attention to this. You were able to recognize by keeping a sleep diary all those good nights that you were having, and perhaps the progress you were making over the 8 weeks.
Yeah. And, I was just kind of remembering back to those first couple of weeks, and I think, oh man, I'm only going to get 3 hours of sleep or 4 hours of sleep tonight. And almost looking at it as a failure, like, I'm not doing this right. And once I got past that and was able to see some progress on the diary, it kind of helped eliminate some of those anxieties I did have around, I'd think to myself, oh, I'm not going to have a good night of sleep. It's going to have to go in the diary as 4 hours or 4.5 hours. And, that's way off what I want it to be. Once I got past those first couple weeks, it was much easier. And I think, having your guidance around knowing that the first weeks of the program aren't easy, they're not designed to be easy or to improve your sleep right away. I think having that guidance and knowledge was important.
Yeah, I think it's important to just emphasize that just like it took time for insomnia to develop and become entrenched, it takes time to kind of unpick it, and implement techniques that help you to kind of undo that and to get your sleep back on track for the long term. That's important to just consider and bear in mind.
Right.
So 10 months ago, you finished the course. How's your sleep been since then? Ups and downs along the way. And how's your sleep now?
Yeah, generally it's been much, much better. And I'm so grateful for that. And there's definitely been some ups and downs here and there, but one of the things that I also learned in the course was that I've been able to identify some of the causes a lot of times when I've had rough nights. I mean, sometimes for sure it's because of my kids waking me up, and those are clear, disruptions in my sleep. Sometimes it's, having more charged conversations with my wife at bedtime, which is something we both try to avoid. But sometimes those come up, and, it's harder for me to get to sleep. But I'm able to see the next day, or even in the moment of, I'm not going to get a lot of sleep tonight. I know the reason. So I don't have the charger anxiety around it that I used to. And, the one thing I've also noticed that's a big change is that when I do have trouble sleeping and falling asleep, and, last week was an example. I had a couple nights when I couldn't fall asleep right away. So I got out of bed after about a half hour. I read for 30 minutes, came right back to bed and fell asleep pretty quickly. So just getting up that one time, those couple of nights, worked great. And I was able to sleep, get probably 6 hours and felt fine the next day. Ironically, my son woke up 3 times last night, which is pretty unusual. He's kind of in this phase now where he's starting to have some nightmares and bad dreams, which he's about 2.5. And, my wife and I switch off nights with the baby monitor to go in with him. And last night was my night. So I found it ironic that the night I debut on the podcast, my son keeps me up, woke me up 3 times. And I probably got 5 hours of sleep, but, my attitude around this versus a year ago, I'd be like, oh, my day's going to be terrible. But, I don't feel that way at all. I know I'm going to sleep well tonight. My wife's got the monitor tonight, so I'm guaranteed not to be woken up.
Yeah.
And it's just it's definitely a different way of living for sure.
Yeah. I think just talking to you about it, it's the transformation, just the way you think about sleep. You don't really spend any time worrying or thinking about it anymore. You're certainly not anxious about it in response to a bad night. And really, that's where we want to get, by implementing all these CBT-I techniques. We want to get you back to that stage where you're not really concerned about sleep anymore. You don't spend your days thinking about it or worrying about how your day's going to be. If your sleep is disrupted, you can maybe recognize if there was any cause for that, like you just described. Of course, if your son's getting up during the night, it's going to disrupt your sleep. But then just not responding to it in a negative way. And really that's the ultimate transformation, because you're just back to that stage where you just don't even really think about sleep anymore. But anytime sleep is a problem, you've got all the skills to just re-implement to get your sleep back on track. That's the real beauty of these CBT-I techniques.
Yeah, that last part you said is the real key, because anytime there are, 1 or 2 or 3 tough nights of sleep during a week, I know how to get it back on track now. I have that confidence and experience to be able to do that. And there's always, there's sometimes there's some nights where I can't explain why I can't fall asleep, but I often look at it like, well, my body's just not needing, X hours of sleep tonight, 7 hours of sleep. I only need 5 tonight or 6 tonight. And I just look at it that way, move on, move past it, because it's inconsequential on the big scheme of things. And, but it's just a different way of living. I mean, my wife and I would sleep in separate beds quite a bit when I was really struggling with it, because I didn't want to wake her up, and I had, anxiety about waking her up, which added to my own anxiety and sleep arousal of not being able to fall asleep. So I'm able to sleep in the same bed with her now and not have that same anxiety. And that's a big difference.
Oh, I bet. That's amazing. Well, I just want to end with one last question that I think is really helpful for everyone listening. So here's the question. If someone with chronic insomnia is listening and feels as though they've tried everything, that they're beyond help, they can't do anything to improve their sleep, what would you tell them?
I would say you've got to try this course. I really feel like I've tried so many different things on my own, and tried a course not too dissimilar from yours, from the book that I read, but just having that personal support from you, and in combination with the process that you lay out in the course you've designed, is so effective. And I really can't see how it wouldn't help anyone who's really struggling, even just rock bottom struggling with the worst insomnia. And I've had the worst of just no sleep at all. I've had those nights when I haven't slept, or I've gotten 1 hour or 2 hours of sleep, and they aren't fun. But this course works, and just having a plan in place that is really proven to help people. It's helped me. I know you've helped many other people. And I think not feeling alone was the other piece of this, because having insomnia is so, it evokes for me like such a feeling of loneliness. And you mentioned isolation, and that was some of the worst mental, torture of it for me. It was like, I'm the only one in the world not getting sleep right now. And, just the catastrophizing of my thoughts was some of the worst. But having you as a connection was so key, because it wasn't just me trying to do it by myself.
Well, I'm really grateful for that, and I really appreciate that I had the opportunity to work with you. I like to position myself more as the guide. I think that, I can give you the suggestions and give you the guidance, but it really is up to the individual to kind of follow through and put their effort in, and the clients that are most successful, like yourself, are the ones that implement the techniques, and give them a chance, because like you said during this episode, in the short term, they can be really difficult. So I just like to emphasize that the success is ultimately just down to you, because you're the person that implemented the techniques, put all that effort in, and had faith in them, and managed to come out the other side. I was merely just the guide, helping you along the road. So just make sure that you recognize that you are the primary driver of your own success.
Well, I appreciate it. And I also greatly appreciate you putting the course out there, because it's a big need. It really is. And I think it satisfies a need out there in the world that people need, and people need that kind of personal connection. It can't be just about reading a book. You've got to have somebody to help guide you. And so I'm appreciative of that.
All right. Well, thank you so much again for your time, Jeff, and for sharing your story. I think a lot of people are going to identify with your experience with insomnia, and I'm hoping that it encourages them that there is a light at the end of the tunnel. They can get past their insomnia. They can get through it, just like you did. Just like you got through it, they can too. So thanks again for your time.
Absolutely. Thanks, Martin. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to the Insomnia Coach podcast. If you're ready to implement cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia CBT-I techniques to improve your sleep, but think you might need some additional support and guidance, I would love to help. There are two ways we can work together. First, you can get my online coaching course. This is the most popular option. My course combines sleep education with unlimited support and guidance and is guaranteed to improve your sleep. I will teach you and help you implement new CBT-I techniques over a period of 8 weeks. This gives you time to build sleep confidence and notice results without feeling overwhelmed. You can get the course and start right now at insomniacoach.com/online. I also offer a phone coaching package where we start with a 1-hour call. This can be voice only or video, your choice, and we come up with an initial 2-week plan that will have you implementing CBT-I techniques that will lead to long-term improvements in your sleep. You get unlimited email-based support and guidance for 2 weeks after the call, along with a half-hour follow-up call at the end of the 2 weeks. You can book the phone coaching package at insomniacoach.com/phone. I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Insomnia Coach podcast. I'm Martin Reed, and as always, I'd like to leave you with this important reminder. You can sleep.